Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Dawn of the Dead 1978. So I say that just because, as if you would not know, there actually is a Dawn of the Dead remake that is done in 2004. I have also reviewed that movie in case someone did not know and stumbled upon this movie trying to find something with Dawn of the Dead in it. This is, of course, the original blue colored zombies. I say that because really we have a bunch of zombies within this film all looking very much like Smurfs. Bizarrely, it makes no sense. I guess they couldn't have, I guess maybe they were trying to go with some kind of different color of zombie that wasn't green or wasn't red, so they went with blue. I don't know. I don't know what happened with the whole makeup of that movie. I guess they were trying to do something different, and I don't know, maybe the reason why these zombies became zombies is because they ate a Smurf. I don't know. Going on to this film, I kind of like the fact that we end up having zombies actually within this mall, where the original or the remake of the Dawn of the Dead just has it to where it seems like there's a complete mall that is already empty because I guess it is well before this mall is timed to open. I honestly think that this variation with what they end up doing with the mall is a little bit more exciting, in all brutal honesty. I think reasonably, I kind of feel like this version has a little bit more excitement going on it onto it. There's a little bit more going on. Where I think as the remake tends to have little bits and pieces here and there that can get your excitement. And also, it is a fairly fun movie, and plus, it still is a there are bits and pieces within this movie that are within this movie as well as the remake that are just kind of action packed. Plus, also you have a lot of the original actors from this film actually in the remake as well. So that's kind of like a fun little Easter egg of which that people may or may not know. Really, I don't know who all exactly had gone on to all be in that remake. I guess we'll have to figure that out at someday. Uh, because I do remember that Ken Foree, I'm hoping I'm saying that right, was in the remake. I also know the guy who is the motorcycle raider, the guy that has the big machete. He is also in the remake, but I don't know if anybody else is actually in the remake also. Going into this film, I just kind of find it to be fun. I think the beginning of this movie is kind of like very, very slow. Like, I think to me, how we have to kind of get these characters together is kind of just a goofy concept or kind of a goofy approach. Because we end up having seemingly both Roger and Peter, who are both police officers in bizarrish blue jumpsuits who are to eventually end up with both Stephen and Florence and eventually go on to be in a helicopter together to try and scramble out of this madness. Really, that's how I could probably open up this entire review. Just because reasonably there's a lot of slow moving parts in the very beginning of this film. The most exciting part of this film is eventually when these characters make it to the mall. If anything, probably also the more exciting part about the remake is there is a lot more people with this mall, whereas in this movie you just get these four characters for bulk this movie having to eventually deal with these zombies who are at some point wreaking havoc upon this mall eventually once they, I guess, continue to just walk around. The kind of fascinating thing I think though is how these people try to hide out within this mall. It kind of does remind me of a video game called Dead Rising 2, where we end up having a lot of the people who are just kind of hiding out in the in kind of the air duct ish like section of the mall, to where eventually we end up having our hero having to crawl through these air ducts to eventually make down to a further part of the mall where he is to eventually go on to eventually tear through a lot of these zombies. Like, we have it to where I think Dead Rising probably does, or Dead Rising 2 probably really does take a lot uh, from this film. I think because it's kind of really interesting how they kind of do that game, and how I'm just realizing it now that 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 this movie kind of feels very similar to that game, with the exclusion of having a one character time limit event thing going on, and so on and so forth. I really do enjoy this movie for its simpleness. It doesn't have to be a movie where you have to have a lot of things all going on crazily all at the same time. I really like the fact that we end up having these characters who eventually try to outsmart the zombies, and then eventually realize they're like, well, hey man, like, now that we've gotten basically into a much more safe zone, let's go shopping. And then we have like a montage of all the people ending up going and trying things on, or like trying to see what is the best thing to get. We end up having them quite at points in time here, kind of throwing in those mall or those shopping lingos where it's like one stop shop kind of thing, where they consistently kind of work that into the script somewhere. We end up also having this movie kind of go into a strategy mode, which I think is kind of interesting. We end up having these characters trying to figure out the best way of how to try and kind of case in their mall to where no one else is going to come in, or the zombies are going to get in as well. So eventually we end up having both Steve and or Peter and Roger doing most of the legwork to really try and prevent these zombies from getting in. And then, like, it takes them a fairly long time to realize, hey, maybe we should probably clean out this mall and make sure that no other zombies get in. Like, it kind of takes a while to do that procedure. It seems like they're fine with reasonably just uh, kind of playing around with these zombies, toying around with them, until eventually they start to realize, well, maybe we should actually clean this mall out. Maybe that seems like a smart procedure. And so that's when they end up kind of going along within this movie. But, anyways, I thought that this movie was really just. A lot of people could say it's like, man, this movie kind of feels fairly like odd or outdated or whatever. Um, some people would love the remake just because it kind of uh, like makes a more interesting story slash journey, whichever. To me, I can like both remake and original because there's certain things that I could enjoy about the original, and I could also um, enjoy also about the remake. Like, there's like the remake, I kind of like the whole story of it all. Like, for the original, I kind of like the fact that there are simple things like zombies in the mall already. There is consistent times of which that you have to kind of be concerned that someone is going to get eaten alive. So, really, with that said, Yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say for the cryptic like sense of this movie. I kind of even went into the story a little bit. But anyways, yeah, we really have it to where it's kind of an interesting way of which that this story eventually ends up turning. But I would also say that I kind of just would say that it's surprising that this movie wasn't consistently remade or consistently had sequels to it or have been a franchise or whichever. Like, I think this is one movie where you could have almost done an entire show called Dawn of the Dead and really could have really had more people come to this mall. Like to me, like the thing of it is where it's just like, man, they could have really used this mall to its real true benefit. There could have been a number of scenarios that could have happened within the story that could have made this story feel unique, and plus really like we could have had it to where any number of zombies could have ended up into this mall at some point, and it could have been a fascinating story. That's all I'm going to say. So, with that said, let's go into that coveted double five timed territory because we're going to go into spoilers because it's spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, again, before I go, let me know in the comments below if you like the original much more or if you like the remake. If you've only seen the remake and you've never seen the original, whichever one have you, let me know. Some people may hate this original. Some people may hate the remake. Some people may just kind of feel like I do, like kind of both of them. Uh, can exist with their own rights and blue colored zombies. So odd. So odd. But it's okay. Going into this film, so in the very beginning of it, we end up having seemingly Florence, who uh, is in some news reporting place, and it seems that everybody's haggling, everybody's yelling at one another, and all kinds of craziness till eventually Florence ends up going along with uh, Stephen to just get out of here. So we end up going along to have seemingly these police officers who are going to forcibly have to take down these zombies. It seems that there are zombies eating people along the lines. It seems that the news is reporting that there is some infection of sorts that is going on with people. Um, so we end up eventually having these police officers who are going to try and take down these dead people. And here's the thing, we end up having it to where easily within this movie we don't have to come up with a consensus of shooting in the head. Like, we end up having a lot of monster movies where we end up having to figure out how to kill a zombie. They have to shoot them like 20 bajillion times all in the chest and then just go like, well, why isn't it going down? Oh, that sucks. And then we end up having somebody say like, well, shoot them in the head, and then they shoot them in the head, and then they're dead. In this one, we don't have to come to that kind of consensus, which is spendiferous. Cause good God, I don't know how many freaking times in all these horror movies they have to like, oh my God, I shot him like 12 times and I wasted so many bullets and he's not going down. What the heck is going on? Shoot him in the head. You should have shot him after bullet number one goes through the chest and nothing happens. Shoot him in the head. SWAT people will immediately either shoot in the head or in the heart. Why somebody would make that consensus to just be like, well, no, I'm going to shoot him in the leg. I'm going to shoot him in the arm, kind of like in Resident Evil, where you end up having the guy who ends up like shooting the person in the leg repetitiously, and then he's like, he won't go down. That's because you shot him in the leg, you moron. Anyways, moving on. So we eventually have it to where it seems that Roger is trying to skin the cat to make his way to a guy named Peter, who seems to be this big guy who is going to easily just muscle some of these zombies. Like he's the guy that is to basically take a zombie and like fling him from one floor of a mall to the bottom to the ground floor of the mall, which I thought was an interesting approach, even though you obviously knew that it was a dummy or whatever, but it was probably heavy. So we end up having both Roger and Peter clinging together because it seems like they're the only ones that are seeing how really and truly crazy it is. And so we end up having these two police officers ending up mixing it up and making it to both Stephen and Florence, and they are to go onto their helicopter to go and fly around town to eventually notice there are some military forces that are trying to take out the zombies, but then there are also some kind of normal common people, hillbilly-ish like people that I think are also trying to take down these zombies as well. So we end up having us push on to this story because there's some stuff that I don't want to really remember about this movie past a certain point, which is basically I can't wait till we get to the mall because everything before that is just who cares. It's a lot of just who cares. It's just like, oh, like, yay, blue zombies are bum rushing these police officers and they're having to try as much as possible to take these things down. Who cares? Can we get to the mall? Could we have just started this movie in the mall? Could we have pleased started this movie in the mall? I thought that would have made a lot more sense than all this rigmarole. But then again, you would have had to have understood how exactly that these SWAT team members make it into a mall. It doesn't exactly make sense. So we end up having these four people in this helicopter landing on the helicopter pad of this mall, which I'm like, since when does a mall have a helicopter pad? That seems fairly odd, but whatever. So we end up having Peter, who ends up going and breaking a thing of glass of a window for this mall, and we end up finding out that these people can easily make it into this mall. It seems that bizarrely, where this broken window is, there is also some convenient ladder placed to have them get from where they are to the room below them. So we end up having these guys going down into this room to realize it seems that there is a room here and then there is a door that is to lead down a stairwell to eventually lead into the mall. So we end up having it to where these people are to strategize. It's like, well, we really have to like hope that these zombies are never going to figure out that there is this stairwell here or we're done for, or if anybody is to invade this mall, hopefully no one is to ever find this stairwell. So we end up having the SWAT guys, both Peter and Roger, go on to eventually realize that they need to get resources. And so we end up having both Peter and Roger go off to go and run through this mall. And so we end up having Peter eventually getting the keys to open up one of these stores. And so we eventually start to see some of the zombies starting to gather in front of the doors of which that Peter had opened. And so we end up eventually having them try to play a game with the zombies, but we'll get there. So we end up having it to where Roger ends up like just kind of grabbing like whatever he can like just grab on like have onto him. And we end up having Peter who ends up having like a wheelbarrow full of stuff. And we end up having Roger going like, dude, like that's way too much stuff. Like there's no way that we're gonna be able to get through all those zombies to have this like obviously come with us. And Peter's like, well, no, like there's obviously a plan that we can have in place. But if anything, both Peter and Roger are so happy that they're away from the zombies and they're doing their one-stop shop. We end up having to where Roger ends up taking this escalator and like sliding down the middle piece of it, which I thought was really, really cool. So we end up having it to where their plan is to have Roger run to the other side of this store and create a bunch of ruckus for all the zombies to go off to his side, to where eventually Peter is to like see how few zombies there are on his side and to make a run for it. And so we end up having both Roger and Peter eventually realizing that there are few zombies over on their side, so they make a run for the stairwell, which of course they make it there. We end up having Steven, who is to go into, I guess, some uh like it looks like a boiler room, but it's bizarrely a boiler room that is like upstairs, like right where they are already at. So we end up having Steven who ends up going into this like I would call it an air conditioned room or looks like a boiler room to me. That's what it looks like. So we end up having Steven who's going through this questionable boiler room. And so we end up having Steven who is going into here because he hears a ruckus. He hears a something. And so we end up eventually having Steven who is to now have to, I guess, face his very first zombie. And we end up having to where Steven ends up putting numerous bullets into this zombie to eventually realize, hey, maybe it would be a good thing if I actually shoot this thing in the head. And so we end up having Steven who ends up shooting this zombie into the head. And I think we end up having this bullet not exactly hit correctly because here's the thing. We end up having bizarrely the back of this guy's head like explode, but I don't think we actually see anything coming from the front of this guy's face because one, the shadows and the stuff going on into this room, but two, like I think it was just meant for this guy's back of his head to just explode to just tell us that he was shot in the head. But I also feel like the sound of which that this bullet had shot out to like didn't actually make sense for where like it kind of seemed like the bullet wasn't actually nearby. It seemed like the bullet or the shot of this gun was very far away, not even from where Steven actually was. It was sounding kind of weird. It's very odd. So we go along here to have uh Steven come back to the group. We end up having it to where while Peter and Roger are making their way back to the staircase and to make it back to Francine, who is the only one left by herself because Steven had gone on his own to go to this boiler room place. We end up having Francine, who is to eventually seemingly have one zombie who is very monk-esque looking like. It's weird. The zombie's looking weird. We end up having Francine, who ends up going and seemingly having a zombie so strong that he ends up just like pushing his way through into Francine's room, where he is just to be like, yeah, baby, I'm here. And Francine's like, no, I don't have a gun or anything at my disposal besides, I guess, road flares. So we end up having Francine, who is consistently putting up these flares of sorts in front of this zombie, and the zombie's like, oh, rah. But eventually we end up having Francine, who is consistently trying to like shoot off these road flares as if to do anything against this zombie. You would have thought that like Francine would have put this like flare thing in this zombie's face, but again, this is a movie, and then again, really they don't have special effects going on in this film, so it is what it is. So we end up having it to where Francine is scrambling to try to get to the rooftop of this mall by climbing onto this ladder because that's all that she has, and she's just trying to like kick away this zombie. And so we end up having Steven, Peter, and Roger eventually making it back to Francine, and so we end up having it to where Francine is to eventually tell them after this that she wants a gun, because if she's going to be left on her own, like she wants at least a gun. So we end up having also that Steven is breaking it to Peter and Roger that also Francine is actually pregnant. And so they're like, oh, well, like, does she want the kid? Do you guys want the kid? Like there is still time to back out of this. Like if you want to abort it, you can. Like reasonably I can understand with what's going on right now. And we end up having to where Francine is like, no, like I want the kid. Like I think I want the kid. And we end up having Francine kind of talking to Steven about it. So sadly enough, Francine never actually has the child within this movie. It doesn't even seem like at all like she's actually showing at all that she is actually pregnant within this film. So it's just like she's pregnant, but she's not exactly showing within this movie. Anyways, so we go along in this movie. So we end up having Steven and Roger deciding, well, hey man, like we should actually like start to strategize here, because we end up having it to where Steven is telling Francine that Francine is kind of maybe pondering whether or not that they should leave her or not, and Steven is like, well, like no, this is like everything that we could have ever wanted. This is like the best spot to stay in. And we have it to where also Roger is kind of making the question of like, well, like shouldn't we leave? Maybe Francine is going to need a doctor at some point, and what happens if we're going to need a doctor to help Francine with her pregnancy? But I guess they didn't really ever think of that because the baby actually doesn't get delivered within this movie. It just doesn't happen. We end up having at some point Francine going and looking at like mother or pregnancy books, but that's about it from what I remember from this movie. So, and supposedly she's like 3 to 4 months along, I guess. So I don't know how movie accurate that is, but anyways. So we go along here and we end up having seemingly some zombies playing around with some mannequins. What douchebaggery like zombies do we have here that are just kind of like they're messing around with mannequins? They're consistently knocking over all kinds of perfumes and colognes and stuff and stepping on the perfumes and or colognes. What kind of crappy maneuvers are these zombies doing? Come on, like, if anything, like, I think Peter and Roger should have trained these zombies a little bit better, if you know what I mean. So, we go along and we end up having Peter and Roger deciding to go and retrieve semis and have them go on to cover the entrances of this mall. to try and block out any other zombies from getting further into this mall, and maybe also trying to put these trucks in front of the entrances to prevent any raiders or any kind of outsiders from trying to easily figure out a way to get into this mall. So we end up having both Peter and Roger going on to get these trucks. And so we end up having it to where slowly but surely it seems that Roger is losing his effing mind. And so we end up having Roger, who is also becoming very careless. It seems that eventually we end up having it to where Steven is in his helicopter watching over both Peter and Roger. And here's the thing, they easily early on end up getting walkie talkies, but I don't even think they actually use them through a bulk of this movie, which I thought was ignorant. So I thought it was stupid on their part. Like, you would have thought they would have had a numerous number of probably walkie talkies that these people could have used throughout a number of scenarios going on into this movie, which they barely use, I honestly believe. So, we have Roger, who is to eventually go on to one of these trucks, and he's seemingly taking a while to try and hotwire this car. And we end up having Steven via helicopter watching over Roger, who is to eventually, slowly but surely, Steven is starting to realize that there is a person starting to climb into Roger's truck while he's hotwiring the car, because Roger ended up leaving a door open for eventually a zombie to just come on in. So we eventually have it to where Roger ends up fighting off these zombies and is ending up shooting pretty well these zombies, and eventually we also have it to where Peter is kind of waiting a while for Roger, and so we end up having Peter, who is to eventually make his way to make it back to Roger. So we end up eventually having Peter having to technically start to save Roger when Roger eventually starts making these mistakes. And so eventually we end up having Roger, who ends up doing his job, getting his truck, and then transitioning from his vehicle, which he is parked at this mall, to eventually jumping into Peter's van. But then we end up realizing that Roger ends up leaving his sack in this truck, and so he has to go back for it. And so Peter is like, dude, like, you're making a lot of mistakes. It's like, really, at this point, like, I am not exactly having my full-on trust of you right now. Like, if anything, kind of like what you're doing, the the mistakes that you're making, like, are almost going to at some point affect me and put my life in jeopardy. So, like, are you on the level there, buddy? Like, are you on the straight and narrow? Like, come on, man. And so we end up having Roger confirming to Peter that he's on the straight and narrow. And so we end up having Peter, who's like, okay, I'm trusting you. So we end up having Roger, who is to go and jump to his other vehicle to try to get his satchel or his sack or whatever. And so we eventually have it to where Roger is kind of like barely going from one vehicle to the other, and eventually he ends up dropping his satchel to where he ends up having to drop down where a bunch of other zombies are around. And we end up having Roger, who is trying to scramble to get this satchel to make it back into Peter's car. The problem with that is we end up having zombies who go and grab Roger. At some point, we end up having one zombie bite Roger on the arm, and while Roger is to try to scramble back into Peter's vehicle, one zombie also bites him pretty good on the leg. So we end up having it to where Roger is writhing in pain, and so we end up having both Peter and Roger making their way back because I guess they are done for the day. So we end up now having to figure out, like, okay, well, how long before Roger is eventually going to become that thing called a zombie? Is it going to be instantly? Is it going to be within hours? And so it seems that Peter gives us an exact timetable of how long Roger is going to not be a zombie for. It seems that Roger is given 3 days to not be a zombie. It seems that Roger or Peter tells us that he had known some guy that took 3 days to become a zombie. Coincidentally, I guess he probably timed it out onto his watch to say, yeah, exactly 3 days from now, so that way we can still have Roger in this movie and he can do things because we really like this actor, and it's just too bad that he's like going to have to become a zombie because somebody had to. So we end up having Roger, who is stuck in this wheelbarrow while they are trying to go and take out all of these zombies, because we end up having Steven and Peter going and trying to close every single opening of this mall, trying to make sure that every door that these zombies could get into is now locked, and there's no way for these zombies to get in through this seemingly impenetrable glass. And so eventually the zombies will realize that they're not going to get in, so they'll get out. So we end up having eventually that that Stephen and Peter are to clear the house of these zombies. Basically, one by one, we end up having Stephen and or Peter starting to go on and like just basically just tear through a lot of these zombies. We end up having at some point in time eventually also we end up having them grabbing a car of sorts through this mall. It seems like at some point it seems like this mall was probably selling a car, so really we have it to where the guys are just driving a car through this mall. It's kind of fun. And we eventually have it to where Roger is like driving this vehicle, this car, and eventually it ends up that while Roger is to eventually get this car, we end up having him getting nibbled a little bit more upon, really just accelerating that Roger is going to be dead. Or no, wait, he doesn't get nibbled on. He ends up having some zombie like poke through this guy's wound, and I guess accelerate this guy's bleeding a little more. So we end up having Roger, who is eventually driving through this mall, and so we eventually having them one by one starting to clear this mall and consistently try to take these zombies out, and it's really kind of fun to watch them like figure out how to strategize and otherwise how to try to clear out this zombie invasion. They also are kind of doing some funny things once we get this whole zombie mess cleared out. And so eventually once they go and shoot and kill all of these zombies, because eventually we also have a gun store within this mall, luckily, where there's a bunch of bullets and so on and so forth that Peter and Steven find. We end up having them clear out all of these zombies to eventually take all the zombies and to put them into some uh, refrigerator, some big, gigantic, massive, like restaurant refrigerator where there's a bunch of food and stuff in there. And so they end up tossing a bunch of zombies in there and calling it a day. We end up having we end up having Peter and Steven just and even Roger just kind of having fun with this mall. They are playing around with some of the sports equipment that is in there. I guess there's a sports store within this mall, and so they're like playing around with the basketballs. We end up having, of course, Peter who is like slam dunking and stuff. We end up having eventually that Peter and Steven is to realize that it seems there is some kind of uh, section and or part of the store where there is a register of sorts that just has loads and loads of money. So they're like, well, hey, like can't be too cautious about all this. Like maybe one day everything will get back to normal, and then money will be important again. So we end up having them pocketing like tons and tons of money just because they think that like this is going to be important again sometime soon. So we eventually go on to have these people having fun with this mall. Eventually, it seems that eventually where these guys are hiding out at, eventually it seems they are to get a bed within this room. But it seems like they are all still uh, like they're to get the real essential things like TVs and radios and stuff like that, so they can hear what's going on. They can hear the news report of this bizarrish uh, uh, like scientist with this patch kind of talking about how exactly uh, this zombie thing had broken out and been infected and whichever. And it's all a bunch of nonsense. It's all just, but like, anyways, moving on. So we get to the main interesting part within this movie after this whole transitional montaging of just running through this mall. So, killing and so on and so forth. So, we end up now having the next part of this story, which is to eventually have these more motorcycle raiders appear within this mall. I'm going to pause here for a second. Before we get to the raiders and the motorcycle raiders and them trying to get into the mall, the one thing that I also wanted to reflect on is the fact that I think this line or this approach kind of gets used frequently throughout a lot of other zombie movies, where we end up having the characters who are realizing that eventually these zombies are to come to this mall, and immediately they are asking themselves, why is it that all these zombies are coming to this mall? Why is it that they all need to come here? And we end up having Peter kind of mentioning that, well, maybe it's just a thing for them. Maybe it's like a thing that they used to do in their previous life, so they're going back to the only things in their mind that they can remember, that they used to go to this mall. I think that that does kind of work, to have like past memories kicking in for these undead, but I also feel like it is also fairly goofy. Like I could say that the real reason why that these zombies are making it and trying to break into this mall is because they know that this is the only real life living person people that are still alive. Hence why they are kind of tracking these humans all the way to this mall. We have it to where a lot of times in a lot of zombie shows and or movies, we eventually have it to where all the zombies seem to eventually be able to have some kind of sense of where humans are, to where eventually a lot of them just start to stockpile all around a mall, for this example, or a prison and other things, or any other location that eventually does have at some point humans within them. To eventually have a Night of the Living Dead movie where eventually we end up having an entire home seemingly breaking into through windows, and having eventually some guys scrambling to get up onto an attic to avoid all these zombies coming for him at some point. So, going in here, let's get into the motorcycle raidist people. So, we end up having these motorcyclists kind of eventually going on to scouting out the places which they are. Eventually, we end up seeing both Peter and Roger kind of noticing these people and realizing, like, man, they have must have been able to just survive the entire time on the road, which is kind of bizarre. So, we eventually have it to where we end up seeing these motorcyclists who was like, you know what, this mall seems like a pretty sweet spot, and it seems like we can be able to make a pretty good amount of like stocking up ability when going to this mall. Hey, let's see if we can go and try to get in there. So we end up eventually having it to where the motorcyclists are trying to get a radio connection with the people with the mall to let them know that they're basically going to try to make their way in there. And so we end up eventually having Peter and eventually Steven uh, scrambling to try to come up with some kind of defense. Because we eventually have it to where Roger is pretty near and close to eventually just becoming a zombie. And we end up having it to where Roger is like go ahead and take me out before I become one of them. Like I will really try to like prevent myself from becoming one, but you're gonna have to take me out if I become a zombie, kind of thing. So we go along and we have these motorcyclists, and so we end up having it to where they are to easily go into one of the trucks and drive it away from the mall, and then have all these motorcyclists enter this mall, kind of like ram through it or whatever to try to get in here. We end up having Peter, who is to set off the fire alarm to eventually have the zombies come into this mall also because of the sound, so that way, reasonably, no matter how big of a number that all of these motorcycle gang members are, it kind of evens out with a bunch of zombies that are also in this mall as well. So we end up just seeing this mayhem and or havoc ensuing by these motorcyclists just driving in circles around this mall. We eventually end up having eventually all these motorcyclists getting off their motorcycle and eventually attacking these zombies. We end up having the leader of this motorcycle raider gang thing eventually going on and putting a machete through one of the zombies' heads. There isn't actually any real legitimate name for any of these motorcycle raiders. They're just called motorcycle raiders. So, bizarrely, we end up eventually having these people kind of really ransack this mall. Eventually, somebody ends up grabbing a bunch of pies, and we end up having a bunch of the raiders going and hitting zombies with pies. I guess really trying to do some kind of clown maneuvers because we end up having, of course, one of also the raiders going and hitting these zombies with water, with like a little shooting device that kind of seems like a clown move. And I'm just like, okay, what is the point of this here? Shouldn't they have gone and like it kind of feels like they're wasting like not only water, but also it just kind of feels like they're wasting like pies and stuff that they could have actually had. It also just kind of feels like shouldn't they have realized that like kill all these zombies off as quickly as possible? Like why are they playing with their food before they kill it kind of thing? Going into here, so eventually it seems that more and more, eventually we end up having it to where we go along and eventually while all this havoc is being ensued, we end up having both Peter and Steven, who are kind of running through this mall, trying to figure out their best defenses. Well, Peter is kind of doing more of the carrying here, and Steven is just trying to like avoid getting killed. We end up having at points in time Steven trying to shoot off some bullets here and there, but we eventually have it to where eventually most of the raiders, I guess, are to eventually get killed off via these zombies, and we eventually have it to where eventually these zombies are just kind of ransacking this mall to the point to where eventually it ends up at some point that Steven is to eventually get bitten by a zombie, nibbled onto the neck, nibbled onto the arm, all kinds of things, and he is to surely and but quickly become a zombie, and eventually he is to lead a charge with other zombies to get through, which is now a wooden barrier to get to this stairwell to get to uh, Francine, who is, of course, just kind of waiting with a gun and just to see what is to happen. So, because they had tried to put some facade of a wall so that way there would not be any of either zombies or raiders who end up like thinking that this door exists, door to get to this stairwell to get to these people. And so we end up realizing that eventually these zombies end up just kind of like walking through uh, this fake wall to, because it's basically made out of like paper basically for the most part. It kind of feels like wallpaper or something. It's not really strong enough. I guess they were thinking that uh, like if anything, like they wouldn't have made that for zombies. They would have just made that, I guess, for somebody who is just casually walking by and thinking that this is just going to blend in to the normal wall, and it doesn't. So we end up having Steven zombified, getting to Francine, and we end up having forcibly Francine having to kill Steven and then realizing that it is Steven. So we end up eventually having Peter, who is eventually making his way back to Francine, realizing that seemingly it is a lost cause to see if Steven had made it out of here. So Peter ends up making his way back to Francine. Because we end up having it to where Peter is on the walkie with Steven and he doesn't respond. And we end up having him waiting for a very long time for Steven to respond, and he doesn't. So we end up having Peter doubling back to Francine. And so we end up having Francine, who had at some point asked Steven to help her learn how to be able to fly this helicopter, because eventually she thought at some point that Steven might quite possibly die, and so somebody else needed to learn how to do the helicopter, of which that has to be her. So we end up having it to where Francine is to decide, like, dude, I am getting out of here. I am leaving. I am outie 5,000. And we end up having it to where Peter is like, well, I don't think I can leave. Like, I just don't think that I could just leave here. Like, I think I just don't want to give up. Like, I just don't want to accept this loss. And so we end up having Francine going like, okay, well, I'm just going to go into the helicopter and I'm going to leave without you. And so we end up eventually having Peter, who is to eventually almost put a gun to his head, while all these zombies are eventually starting to get closer and closer to him to where they're basically at arm's length with him. And so we end up having Peter ending up deciding before Francine goes and leaves off. We end up having Peter who ends up deciding, dude, what the heck am I doing? I'm gonna get out of here. So we end up having Peter scrambling up to the rooftop to where it seems like there are some zombies who end up following him. And so we end up having Peter who ends up jumping onto the helicopter, and he ends up asking how much fuel do they have, and probably not much. So we end up going along and having them try to figure out what is the best course of action for them to go. Like, I think at some point there was some people that were mentioning that they were going to try to leave to go to some islands to think that reasonably they would be safe there. And that's kind of funny because when looking at it, that's what happens in the remake. They all decide to go to some islands because they think that there are very few people within those small islands that they think they'll be fine. But you'll know what happens within the remake if you've watched it. So going on into this, we eventually have it to where Peter and Francine eventually fly off, and I think that's what I would probably call this an ending to this review. I kind of like this remake, or I kind of like the original, because like I think there is some suspenseful moments. Reasonably, there's a lot of times where you have these zombies that are within this mall. Like it's much more exciting than the remake, where it's just kind of like a lot of downtime, where it's like eventually people having to go out of their way to eventually find these zombies instead of the zombies finding them for the most of this movie. We end up having also eventually in the remake, we eventually have more people being added into this mall, which I actually like that a little bit more than recently having it to where we just have four people the entire time throughout this mall, and they are clearing out a big section of zombies within this mall, and then eventually we end up having raiders who end up coming in here and trying to just steal everything and take everything from these people. Kind of sucks. But you could also look at that and like reminisce and just be like, well, maybe this whole Raiders thing kind of eventually spurred into like The Walking Dead, where The Walking Dead eventually had that Negan clan. Maybe Robert Kirkman had seen this movie and just been like, well, like maybe this could quite possibly be like my Negan group. Who knows? Maybe he had been seeing any number of zombie movies and immediately thought of like, well, hey, uh, like eventually we need to have these like raiders come in here, so that's got to be maybe Negan. Who knows? Um, but then again, yeah, I think that's all I had to say about this movie. I just kind of find it fun. I like this movie. Like really, again, it probably like if you would probably just fast forward it to the point of when they get to the mall. I think those are the most interesting moments. I think everything before that is just kind of like, yeah, who cares? Like, let's get to that mall. That's the only part. So with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.